On July 16, 1945, in the Jornada del Muerto desert in New Mexico, the U.S. Army conducted the world's first detonation of a nuclear weapon. 10 days later, the Allied leaders issued the Potsdam Declaration, calling for the unconditional surrender of Japan in World War II. On August 6th, a U.S. Air Force B-29 dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, and on August 9th, another B-29 dropped another atomic bomb on Nagasaki. The bombings are estimated to have killed between 109,000 and 206,000 civilians, or roughly somewhere between the current populations of Billings, Montana, and Salt Lake City, Utah. 4 years later, on August 29, 1949, the Soviet Union conducted their first nuclear weapons test. 4.5 years after that, on January 12, 1954, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles gave a speech announcing that the U.S. will protect its allies via the deterrent of massive retaliatory power, a policy supported by a nuclear stockpile that grew into the tens of thousands throughout the 50s and 60s.
Deterrence is the art of producing in the mind of the enemy the fear to attack.
In the 1960s, under Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, the driving foreign policy of the United States with regard to the Soviet Union became a doctrine of mutually assured destruction. In a speech on September 18, 1967, Secretary McNamara was explicit about this. Quote, "The cornerstone of our strategic policy continues to be to deter nuclear attack, and that assured destruction is the very essence of the whole deterrence concept." The gist of mutually assured destruction was that both sides would maintain enough nuclear capability to be able to withstand and quickly retaliate to a first-strike nuclear attack. Therefore, both sides would be theoretically deterred from a first-strike nuclear attack because of the assured destruction they would face in a retaliatory strike. Basically, both sides had enough firepower to destroy the other, and both sides knew it. Great premise for a classic American comedy, right? When I was rewatching Dr. Strangelove for this video, one thing that really struck me was how uncomfortably plausible everything is. I've seen the movie probably 6 or 7 times, but I never really noticed or internalized that before. As I watched this most recent time, I kept waiting for the moment or plot point that was a little too ridiculous, or a little too extraordinary, but it kinda never came. Yeah, it's a satire and has its moments of ridiculousness, but for a movie that ends with the annihilation of all mankind, it's not as unbelievable as I would hope. Apparently the US Air Force thought so too, as the movie has to start with a title card assuring the audience that it's not plausible. I mean, damn, this is supposedly a comedy movie, and it opens with a shit-serious disclaimer saying, "Don't worry, despite what you're about to see, you totally won't be killed in a nuclear fallout because of an insane general." Really sets the tone for the laughs. I also love this reiteration that no character is based off any real person living or dead, a disclaimer usually reserved for the very, very, very end of the credits. Instead, they felt it was important enough to include in the title card, likely because fictional President Merkin Muffley looks like Harry S. Truman had a baby with Dwight D. Eisenhower, respectively the only man to ever employ the use of atomic weapons in combat, and the president who... yeah. And disclaimer aside, Sellers actually did base his performance on an actual politician.
The one serious point in the film. So you've got to play him seriously. And Peter said, rather like Adlai Stevenson, if he'd become president if the results of the US election had gone the other way, and Stanley said exactly.
While there are a few asks of the audience, none are really that bad. They all feel just plausible enough. I totally buy that there would be a code prefix after giving Plan R, which presents a problem if the order was given by a rogue.
Now, in order to prevent the enemy from issuing fake or confusing orders, CRM 114 is designed not to receive at all, unless the message is preceded by the correct 3-letter code group prefix.
I totally buy that the radio on the bomber would have a self-destruct feature, which they tease,
auto-destruct circuits checked,
and then pay off, meaning the B-52 can't receive the recall order.
I think the auto-destruct mechanism got hit and blew itself up.
I totally buy that a damaged plane could be leaking fuel and have to hit an alternative target.
Well, shoot. We ain't come this far just to dump this thing in the drink. What's the nearest target opportunity?
Meaning the Soviets don't know where the plane is to shoot it down. As the problems compound upon themselves, the code prefix, the B-52 surviving the missile, the leaking fuel, once one problem is solved, another one emerges. Usually because of one small bit of bad luck or ill-informed but defensible decision-making, ultimately resulting in I guess the provisions of Plan R are kind of a big ask.
Well, perhaps you're forgetting the provisions of Plan R, sir.
Particularly the lack of safeguard for a general to just execute it as easily as he did. By the way, I love the wide shot of Ripper bookending before and after he orders the attack. The wide shot makes him look small, perhaps emphasizing the contradiction of someone so far down on the totem pole, someone unelected, ordering something so huge, something that wipes out humanity. And yeah, while the ease of exploitation is probably a huge creative liberty, things like Plan R do exist. They're to prevent what's called a decapitation strike, leaving a chain of command in place in case of an attack on our leadership. I mean, we now all know what a designated survivor is thanks to Kiefer Sutherland. How do I say goodbye? Is it really that outrageous to imagine an attack plan designed to allow for retaliation in the absence of the very top chain of command? I guess the Doomsday device itself may seem a bit ridiculous too, but hear me out. Is it? Isn't the Doomsday device just mutually assured destruction taken to its natural conclusion? Hell, they even say the Doomsday machine saved them money.
Doomsday scheme cost us just a small fraction of what we've been spending on defense in a single year.
It was the practical solution to keeping up in the arms race. That's at least what military strategist Herman Kahn thought. He came up with the concept of a doomsday device in his book on thermonuclear war, as a rhetorical criticism of mutually assured destruction. And he was thus reportedly one of 3 people to serve as real-life inspiration for the eponymous Dr. Strangelove character. I guess it's easy to laugh at the more absurd parts when we're on this side of 1989. And as someone who's only ever lived in a post-Cold War world, in my first 6 or 7 viewings, I was always able to revel in the ridiculousness of Strangelove. But I don't know, maybe it's because I recently read a biography of Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb. Maybe it's because I recently watched a few docuseries about this particular period of US history. Or maybe it's because I've found myself periodically Googling who exactly can authorize a nuclear strike in the last, 2 or 3 years or so. Regardless, while Dr. Strangelove is still really funny, I never realized how scary it is. I mean, read all about Vasily Arkhipov's fateful decision in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Then try to watch Dr. Strangelove and see how funny it is then. And yet, it's still really fucking funny.
Right.
Tell you what you better do, old buddy. You'll see everything. You'll see the big board.
But if you don't get the President of the United States on that phone, you know what's going to happen to you?
What?
You're going to have to answer to the Coca-Cola Company.
No, sir. Excuse me. Also, wen?
So black comedies always have a difficult line to walk because they're, by definition, finding humor in things that are dark or taboo. Considering it doesn't get much darker than the annihilation of life on Earth, and in 1964 it didn't get much more taboo than a senseless and avoidable nuclear war with the Soviets, Dr. Strangelove seems to have an impossibly difficult line to walk. But Kubrick knows how to walk it. When you're dealing with subject matter this serious and consequences this severe, that creates tension. The late great comedian Greg Giraldo said that a good joke creates tension, and the punchline is the release of that tension. The greater the tension, the greater the release. And I think that's basically what Kubrick is doing here. He deals in shit serious subject matter, about as serious as it can get, and this creates tension. And when he turns shit serious subject matter into comedy, that makes for a huge release and huge laugh. And how does Kubrick turn shit serious subject matter into comedy? Contrast. Most often, he's taking high-minded, serious, and perilous political situations and military brinksmanship and contrasting that dire seriousness with ridiculousness.
5.
and if not ridiculousness, then other things that contrast and undercut the seriousness. For example, after a long spiel from the deep-voiced narrator about the Air Force's fleet of B-52s throughout the world, all loaded with destructive nuclear weapons and all within 2 hours of their targets in Russia, always in the air, ready to strike at a moment's notice, which, by the way, was a thing, the first look we get inside the plane, Playboy. Playing cards. Laid back reading a book. Literally asleep at the wheel. Contrasting serious vigilance with leisureliness. P.S. The girl in the centerfold of the Playboy, Miss Foreign Affairs, is actually Miss Scott, Buck's lady friend we meet later. Speaking of Miss Scott, I love how she stands and straightens up to answer the phone. It emphasizes how much she relaxes when she gets flirty with Colonel Puntridge.
Freddie, how are you? Fine, and you?
Again, contrast. The contrast between her business voice with the man she's sleeping with,
General Turgidson, a Colonel Puntridge calling.
And her sultry, familiar voice with the Colonel,
Freddie, the General says could you call back in a minute or two?
is really funny.
The General suggests you call General Ripper, the 843rd Base Commander. Oh. All communications are dead.
I also love how long this ridiculous back and forth lasts. General Turgidson doesn't come out of the bathroom until 2 minutes into the scene. And I love the idea that when an imminent nuclear threat is happening, one of the people in charge is taking a shit when he gets the news.
Tell him to call back.
If a man learns the news that nuclear annihilation is nigh when he's in his office, the result is a documentary. When he's in his living room, it's a social drama. When he's in the bathroom, it's a comedy.
And this same funny idea is echoed later. I love the idea that when a nuclear attack is imminent, the Russian premier is drunk when he gets the news.
I've done as you asked. Be careful, Mr. President. I think he is drunk.
Again, both undercut the seriousness of the situation, but also in a hilariously plausible way. Like, yeah, it could totally happen that a general could be in the bathroom when a life-or-death military situation arises. It's not like world leaders never get drunk. And because the premier is drunk, the president's talking down to him with this patronizing tone is hilarious when contrasted with the seriousness of the situation.
One of our base commanders, he had a sort of, well, he went a little funny in the head. You know, just a little funny. And he went and did a silly thing.
I mean, they get into a pissing contest about who is more sorry that this is happening.
I am as sorry as you are, Dmitri. Don't say that you're more sorry than I am, because I'm capable of being just as sorry as you are.
Direness contrasted with petulance. Another example of contrast, basically everything about General Turgidson, played brilliantly by George C. Scott.
And although I hate to judge before all the facts are in, it's beginning to look like General Ripper exceeded his authority.
This man is obviously a psychotic.
Well, I'd like to hold off judgment on a thing like that, sir, until all the facts are in.
When you instituted the human reliability tests, you assured me there was no possibility of such a thing ever occurring.
Well, I don't think it's quite fair to condemn a whole program because of a single slip-up, sir.
Viewers intimately familiar with the movie will know that that's not exactly how this exchange happens, but I edited this conversation down to illustrate a point, and I hope the point is clear. They're in the middle of a situation with literally tens of millions of lives on the line, and Turgidson's being so delicate and casual, not wanting to pass judgment or rush to any conclusion. It's insane.
No more than 10 to 20 million killed, tops, depending on the breaks.
The casualness, the flippantness. Again, sharp contrast to the situation. It's staggering. And yeah, I guess I find this funny in a nervous laughter sort of sense.
Mr. President, I'm not saying we wouldn't get our hair mussed.
But his flippantness is also disconcerting.
5.
To act so animated and silly when proposing an all-out first strike nuclear attack. Again, funny but disconcerting. According to James Earl Jones, yes, he's in this, George C. Scott didn't want to play Turgidson so ridiculous, and Kubrick only got him to do super over-the-top takes by assuring Scott they were just practice, warm-ups, and they wouldn't be in the movie. And then he put them in the final movie. George C. Scott never worked with Kubrick again, ostensibly because he was mad at him for using these takes. Roger Ebert, being the genius that he was, said this about the humor in Dr. Strangelove. People trying to be funny are never as funny as people trying to be serious and failing. A man wearing a funny hat is not funny, but a man who doesn't know he's wearing a funny hat, now you've got something. Yes, there's a severe contrast between the direness of their predicament and their silly, petulant, flippant responses to their predicament. But what really makes it funny is that they don't think they're being silly, petulant, and flippant. Sure, this line is hilariously ironic.
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Hey, your fighting is barbaric and unbecoming of the fancy room where we dignified people strategize fighting.
That's the joke.
But it's mostly funny because the president is completely earnest and doesn't see the inherent irony. He doesn't realize his hat is funny. General Turgidson doesn't realize his hat is funny. Major T.J. Kong doesn't realize his hat is funny. And neither did Slim Pickens, the man playing him, as Kubrick didn't tell him the movie was a comedy, as legend goes. This is the actor playing it straight.
Let's get this thing on the hump. We got some flying to do.
I can't really blame Slim Pickens for not knowing the movie was a comedy. After all, the actors inside the B-52 are the only ones who never interact with either Peter Sellers or George C. Scott. And for all they know, they're just in a movie about nuking the Soviets.
Well, boys, I reckon this is it. Nuclear combat toe-to-toe with the Ruskies.
The book the screenplay is based on, Red Alert by Peter George, writing under the pseudonym Peter Bryant, isn't a comedy. When Kubrick first began research for the movie, back when he had reportedly read 50 books about nuclear weapons and just had a vague desire to make a Cold War movie, he had no intention of making it a comedy. But as he began to construct a story and write scenes, the comedy became unavoidable.
He started out very literally to make a very serious film about nuclear gamesmanship, and saw that it couldn't be done as he was in the material, and he came up with this idea of a nightmare comedy.
I think it's safe to say when most people think of political films, they think of dramas or thrillers. But I'd argue the fact that Dr. Strangelove is a comedy makes it even more political. Kubrick clearly has some things to say about nuclear brinksmanship and mutually assured destruction, and he says them by pointing out the inherent ridiculousness of the decades-long foreign policy of the world's two largest superpowers. I mean, look at the set design of The War Room by the late, great Ken Adam. Steven Spielberg called it the best set ever designed. The big board has been compared to a pinball machine. The table they're sitting at is green, even though you can't tell in the black and white, evoking a poker table. Pinball machine, poker table, see where I'm going with this? Aside from the visuals equating nuclear brinksmanship with literal games, there's a more frequent visual metaphor that Kubrick uses to show his opinion of the Cold War and the leadership involved. This opening credit sequence wasn't actually shot by Kubrick and wasn't shot for the movie. It's stock footage of an actual KC-135 refueling a B-52 that editor Anthony Harvey cut together. And the imagery is very blatantly and plainly sexual. And it's not subtle. I mean, it's not. It's just plain sex. Then there's General Ripper's damn cigar. If you've never smoked a cigar before, FYI, most people don't hold it in their teeth with no hands. Most people don't talk in paragraphs while the cigar is in their mouth. And most people remove the cigar from their mouth to take a puff and exhale. This is fairly weird behavior. It's drawing attention to the cigar. There's a visual point being made here. A phallic point.
It's a dick.
Also, he shot from below, implying reverence, power. His badges are prominently displayed in the frame. And Sterling Hayden's pacing and cadence and pauses make it like he's giving a big, important speech.
And the international communist conspiracy to sap and impurify all of our precious bodily fluids.
But the most important thing is,
it's a dick. But that's not important. What's important is it's a dick.
Just before Turgidson leaves to address the situation in the war room, Miss Scott seduces him.
Buck, honey, I'm not sleepy either.
I know how it is, baby.
He implies he'll, tend to her needs when he gets back. So he's all horned up as he goes into the war room. And then she calls him while he's in there. Hey Buck, in case your horniness had worn off due to the impending threat of nuclear war, a reminder. I'm here.
Go back to sleep, hon. Bucky will be back there just as soon as he can.
Sure, maybe he's just saying that to placate her, but maybe he really is just thinking about sex while he should be thinking about how to avoid the imminent nuclear attack.
Of course, it isn't only physical. I deeply respect you as a human being.
Is it any coincidence that this phone call reinforcing Buck's horniness takes place, let me check here, 45 seconds before Buck proposes his all-out nuclear attack plan? And then there's the gun that Ripper uses, and where it's placed. I mean, come on.
It's a dick.
Sense of fatigue, feeling of emptiness followed. Luckily, I was able to interpret these feelings correctly. Loss of essence.
Kubrick and editor Anthony Harvey put the loss of essence line in close-up, highlighting its importance. This whole attack was inspired by being tired after sex.
I first became aware of it, Mandrake, during the physical act of love.
Huh.
Yes, a profound sense of fatigue, feeling of emptiness followed.
Which Ripper assumed to mean he was losing virility, the natural response to which is, of course, launch a nuclear attack. Look how short and stubby his cigar looks when he's defeated, about to kill himself, visually indicating this losing of virility and masculinity.
It's a dick.
And then, of course, one of the most famous sequences and images in the movie. Yeah, I get that he's a cowboy and he's treating it like he's riding a bull or a bucking bronco or something, but come on.
It's a dick.
And I want to point out that in Red Alert by Peter George, the B-52 is unsuccessful in dropping its payload and the nuclear catastrophe is averted. I bring this up to point out that, given the book that he was adapting ends without the death of mankind, Kubrick had an out. He didn't have to end his movie this way, but he diverted from his roadmap of Red Alert and forged his own story path. I think that makes the decision to end the movie this way more pointed, knowing it comes from Kubrick himself, knowing that a more peaceful ending was rejected by Kubrick. His thesis on the Cold War and the nuclear arms race couldn't end peacefully because that would be in conflict with his thesis.
The ratio of 10 women to each man, wouldn't that necessitate the abandonment of the so-called monogamous sexual relationship? I mean, as far as men were concerned.
Among all the questions one could ask here, they go immediately to the sex one. It's probably the least important thing to focus on in this scenario, and it's just the icing on the thematic cake of tying sex with military might.
The women will have to be selected for their sexual characteristics, which will have to be of a highly stimulating nature.
I must confess, you have an astonishingly good idea there, Doctor.
Ugh. Roger Ebert always said that he didn't like that the movie continues after Major Kong's bomb explodes, and that this scene could have been moved up to before the bombing. I think the film would be more effective if the original blast brought an end to all further story developments. But Kubrick clearly has more to say. It's another reason I focus so much on what is proposed here and what happens in these final minutes. This scene is underlined by the fact that it's original Kubrick in spite of the source material, and because it's sort of not the logical endpoint of the story developments, as Ebert pointed out. So, what happens here?
The computer could be set and programmed to accept factors from youth, health, sexual fertility, intelligence, and a cross-section of necessary skills. Of course, it would be absolutely vital that our top government and military men be included to foster and impart the required principles of leadership and tradition.
What Strangelove is proposing, having people apply and selecting the best humans to continue the human race. Boy, this sounds unsettlingly familiar. It's not an accident that as soon as he proposes that government leaders automatically get saved, his inner Nazi comes out. They're making an obvious connection. The Nazi in him is coming out both in his involuntary movements, but also in his eugenics-y and genocide-y proposal.
It would not be difficult, mein Führer. Nuclear reactors could... I'm sorry, Mr. President.
The longer he talks about it, the more excited he gets, and the more out of control his arm gets, the more his inner Nazi comes out. Ebert thought that ending here would be a more appropriate period on the story, but ending here changes the focus of the ending, emphasizing not the event that will likely lead to the death of mankind, but instead the reaction to the event of the people in charge, what their priorities are.
You mentioned the ratio of 10 women to each man.
Which is tied into how they got into this mess in the first place.
I first became aware of it, Mandrake, during the physical act of love.
Instead of using this as a period ending the movie, Kubrick once more underlines the connection to virility.
Mein Führer has been locked!
Kubrick saw the nuclear arms race of the Cold War as chest puffing, intrinsically tied to insecurities about manliness and virility. And maybe that's why I found the movie so uncomfortable to watch on my latest viewing. To be explicit about something I have up to now only alluded to,
they will be met with fire and fury like the world has never seen. Nuclear is just, the power, the devastation is very important to me. If they're small, something else must be small. I guarantee you there's no problem. I guarantee it.
How do I say?
Does Dr. Strangelove feel less like a comedy and more like a horror movie when the actual guy actually in the White House right now, actually in charge of the nuclear codes, assured Americans and the world in a nationally televised debate that, trust me, his dick is big? Yes. Yes, it does. Look, I'm not saying that I think a Dr. Strangelove scenario or something similarly stupid and needlessly destructive is ever gonna actually happen no matter who's in the White House. God willing. But it's just kinda surreal to see this thematic through line in Dr. Strangelove play out in real life. It's just kinda surreal, to say the least. To say the absolute least. Kubrick made a movie at the height of Cold War tensions about the inherent ridiculousness of those tensions, and proposed that a national leader might well end life on Earth in order to prove his manhood. But now that the Cold War's behind us, it's nice to know that that would never actually happen. Motherfucker.
Again, don't know when, but I know we'll meet again.
Of course I like to speak to you. Of course I like to say hello. Not now, but any time, Dmitri. I'm just calling up to tell you something terrible has happened. It's a friendly call. Of course it's a friendly call.